class, and welcome to episode 2 of our film 342, film genre science fiction film. What I want to focus on today is, well, science fiction films and what genre means. Now, if you go to imdb.com and if you search for the genre science fiction, you're going to find well over 1,000 of science fiction films. And then we have to decide which of these are we going to screen for our class. And, well, I could be a monster and just choose the ones that I like, or I could look at what are the best films or the most important films. And these are important distinctions. When a friend of yours sees a movie, you typically say, was it good? And they say, yeah, it was good, or it was okay, or it was terrible. But what they're really saying is whether or not they liked it. And whether or not we like something is really idiosyncratic. It has a lot to do with aspects of who we are, our identity, our gender. For example, science fiction and war films mostly cater to a male audience. They mostly feature male directors and male actors. This has, of course, changed more recently, as a lot of matters of cultural identity have changed in the past 2 decades. Then we've got genres that might be categorized as female, romantic comedies, for example. Then there's genres that appeal to both. So, for example, the horror film, which is kind of a paradox. So when we say, is a film good? What we're really asking is, does this film conform, expand, or meaningfully transgress criteria that have been established over years regarding this genre? And then we can ask whether a film is important. So, is it consequential? Does it have meaningful influence over subsequent films? Now, I expect as you watched Metropolis, there are aspects of it, or, well, you watched parts of Metropolis for most of you. Sorry, buddy. You found it often boring. Many of you had a challenge with it being silent, it being in black and white. And we just have to recognize in the historical context of 1927 moving forward, the advent of synchronic film sound doesn't emerge really until 1927 and 1929. By 1929, that really caused all films after 1930 to be have synchronic sound at the same time, dialogue, music, etc. So it's important because of how influential it was, and I'll probably offer something later in the week to demonstrate that. So we're going to grapple with films that primarily are important and good. But who decides this? And by the way, I'm going to be constantly glancing over there because that's where my notes are, and if it disappoints you that your professor is not omniscient, just pretend I'm looking at my cat. I don't have a cat. So if you Google best science fiction films, you're going to get literally hundreds or more of sites. And they're all going to be slightly different, but there's going to be some conformity. So if we move historically, chronologically, which is always a good thing to do, though at some point it'd be fun to teach this class and go in reverse chronological order. We start with Voyage to the Moon, Metropolis, 1936, Things to Come, which is not as influential, but it really kind of stands in for a 1930 science fiction film, and it demonstrates really some concerns leading up to the explosion of fascism in Europe in 1939, and to an extent the United States at that time. It's really, though, in the 1950s that science fiction film becomes an extremely popular and important genre in the United States and elsewhere. In 1951, we can see 2 distinct forms of science fiction film. Howard Hawks's The Thing, alien comes from space, lands on Earth, is encased in ice many, many years ago, is discovered by scientists who unearth this block of ice. While guarding the alien, one of the scientists throws a electric blanket, which melts the ice. The alien comes out, starts attacking people. They kill it by using an electrical grid. So the very electricity that awoken the monster is what destroys the monster. Technology both is for us and against us. At the same year, Robert Wise's The Day the Earth Stood Still has an alien comes from space, and the humans almost by accident attack him, and only later learn that he was an ambassador from effectively an intergalactic United Nations, demanding that Earth reconcile itself to atomic weaponry and use it appropriately and not as a weapon. So this is, on one hand, with the thing, the monster comes from space, the other, and it's different, it's attacking us, we have to destroy it. On the other hand, we've got effectively an intergalactic ambassador comes to space and is offering to help us so long as we don't destroy ourselves. So the other comes and arrives and we are integrated within it. So there's many films that are important in the 1950s and early 60s, but curiously one of the most important is actually Godzilla, Gojira, from Japan, where atomic weapons awake this monster, which then proceeds to be a city-destroying giant lizard, and he must be destroyed, and the technology used to destroy him is virtually the same technology that awoke him. So why is there this, parallel in science fiction film regarding the monstrous other? It's obviously situated in the context of, for the United States and the Soviet Union, the 1950s Cold War that obviously extended far beyond that and prior to it. But for Japan, that's the only nation upon which atomic weapons have been used during warfare. And so they're, of course, going to have a higher degree of sensitivity regarding the importance of nuclear power, but the threat of nuclear weapons. And so many films from the 1950s in the United States will focus on the monster that comes out of nowhere and must be destroyed. Into the 60s, we get some very different science fiction films, and the most notable of them is Stanley Kubrick's A Space Odyssey from 1968. And we're screening that this half week, and I've got a time code up so you can indicate some scenes that at least I thought were important. And you might use it as an example, both the film and the time coding, to select your own science fiction film for the scene description analysis. You're going to submit a draft this Wednesday, and then I'll look it over, make comments, and send it back to you, and you'll revise it. Then we've got, also in 1968, Planet of the Apes, which grapples with time travel and the self and the other having to reconcile themselves to who's self and who's other, who's us and who's them, with an absolutely fantastic finish, one of the best finishes of any film, science fiction or not, ever. Into the 70s, the science fiction films of the early 70s, like Silent Running, has some great special effects but limited character and plot, but it does introduce the notion that droids, robots, can be characters. Of course, that's been done before. We've got the Maria synthetic in Metropolis. But Logan's Run is really awful. It's really with Star Wars in 1977 that George Lucas kicks off this notion that science fiction can become extraordinarily popular. And indeed, even in the wake of, literally the wake of Jaws 2 years prior, Star Wars was such a blockbuster, it redefined what sorts of movies could make an enormous amount of money, and it raised tremendously the stakes in filmmaking.
Somewhere in space, this may all be happening right now. 20th Century Fox and George Lucas, the man who brought you American Graffiti, now bring you an adventure unlike anything on your planet. Star Wars.
Here they come.
The story of a boy, a girl, and a universe. It's a big, sprawling space saga of rebellion and romance. It's a spectacle, light years ahead of its time.
I am C-3PO, human cyborg relations, and this is my counterpart, R2-D2. Hello.
It's an epic of heroes.
Good luck.
And villains. And aliens from 1,000 worlds.
In the making. Star Wars. Steven Spielberg's near coincident Close Encounters of the Third Kind had a different sense. Rather than a space opera taking place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, the aliens are coming to us now, and we have a recognizable Earth, families and military and mothers and children and fathers in disarray. That these systems of nuclear systems of family, nuclear systems of potential weaponry, the military, scientists, all come together and gather, and the other arrives finally, these spaceships, and they seem terrifying. They seem prepared prior in the film to tear apart families. And instead, they just want to communicate. And so, through bright lights and repeated tonal sounds, the aliens and the scientists begin to communicate. Now, this is clearly self-referential because film is a medium of bright lights and sound. Steven Spielberg, like many directors, is self-referential. Indeed, one of the scientists is played by Truffaut, an early French filmmaker who was absolutely crucial in establishing the French New Wave from 1959 to 1967, an era of directors that would be tremendously influential, especially for George Lucas and other directors. For example, not a science fiction director, but Quentin Tarantino is tremendously influenced by the French New Wave. Into the 80s, we see science fiction to begin to expand really in two different ways. We've got the Lucas Spielberg big budget blockbuster films like the rest of the cycle, the first cycle of Star Wars, episodes 5 and 6, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, and with Spielberg, E.T. All of these were runaway hits, blockbusters, dwarfing the profits from films released their respective years. But we also have James Cameron's Terminator, and prior to that, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, and indeed even 3 years prior to that, Ridley Scott's Alien. Now, Alien follows the premise of the alien from space, only we're in space too. And it's other, and we're self, we're us, and it's them, only it gets into us, right? In a really fantastic scene known as the chestburster. You'll see that on as an example of a scene description and analysis. Then in Blade Runner, you've got this very slow-moving, intellectual film that really, it bombed at the box office because audiences didn't know what to do. They thought Harrison Ford, in the future with a gun in his hand, this is going to be exciting, right? This is going to be great. And you're going to find later this week, in week 2, part 2, that it didn't meet those audience expectations. It's something else entirely. Terminator, in effect, sort of bridges the gap between those two. It's certainly a thoughtful film, but it has its explosions, of course. And it also has its self-other, us-them, of recognizable humans, and something that seems like us, but in fact is not, is organic material covering a steel skeleton. Chronologically, in the 90s, other really important science fiction films, Terminator 2 pushed the boundaries of, as our book points out, the necessity of technology, and computer graphics were crucial in the development of that film. Cameron wanted to use those in the Terminator, the first one, but that technology didn't exist. It was largely invented for that film and has been tremendously influential ever since. We have films like, on one hand, Strange Days, Catherine Bigelow, her direction of a very thoughtful, very thought-provoking film that recognizes recent cultural events like the beating of Rodney King and projects them into a future of 1999, the end of the world, which is kind of like Blade Runner's situation of itself as LA 2019, which is rapidly approaching. It's next year, and we still don't have our flying cars. And then we've got, on the other hand, Jurassic Park, right? Spielberg, would-be blockbuster, definitely a blockbuster. Technology will create dinosaurs, right? And they will destroy us. And it's only hard work and grit which will save us. And then we get to the late 90s with films like Dark City and Existenz and The Matrix, wherein reality itself is science fiction. How do we know what's real, right? So, and that's continued, of course, into the 21st century with films like Inception. Now, films rarely are of a single genre, right? That Titanic is both a disaster film and a romance, and that appeals to two distinct audiences, primarily male audiences, appreciating disaster films and watching little tiny people fall down a great big boat that looks like it's really there, and female audiences, hey, who just want to see two people fall in love and be happy. So, he dies, spoiler. The ship sinks, spoiler. So, some of you might be like a little confused when I included so many comic book films in the list of science fiction films. And especially if you look at the box, when or after you did look at the Box Office Mojo list of the top 5 hits from 1999 to 2018 so far. And that list is dominated by science fiction films, if we include comic book films. But how can we not? Superman is an alien. He's an other who comes from out there to here. And we have to incorporate him into our world, right? That the vanadium that emerges from the land of the Black Panther, Wakanda, is an imagined element that allows the Wakandans to have extremely advanced technology. And importantly, it's not just about technology, it's about a mythic history, that it was incredibly important. This is part of the reason for Black Panther's runaway success. The main character, the hero, is a black man, and he comes from a nation in Africa that has never been colonized. And that was incredibly important for a lot of people, including me. Spider-Man, bitten by a radioactive spider, gains superpowers, right? The Fantastic Four go into space, are blasted by cosmic rays, transform. So the comic book film overlaps tremendously and is informed by the science fiction film. Nevertheless, we can recognize that the comic book films, the strongest genre is, well, the comic book film. And weaker than that, in the context of how audiences approach it, is the science fiction film. There are, of course, comic book films that feature components of romance. For example, Spider-Man is simultaneously a comic book film, a romance, and also, of course, science fiction. Now, there are many types of genres, but there's also types of genres. So what I mean by this is there are genres of setting, films that are defined by their setting. For example, the Western in the American West at the turn of the 20th century. And there's also, well, the science fiction film is often situated in futuristic environments. And even with the sort of fantastical matter of Star Wars' conventional opening a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, that complicates matters only slightly. It really situates it as once upon a time. Then there's genres of iconography, which also includes the Western, revolvers, certain types of hats, horses, tumbleweeds, spurs, boots. And then in science fiction, which is space, the final frontier, and as the popularity of the Western waned in the 1950s, that's when the popularity of the science fiction film waxed. And we know that the iconography of the science fiction film, advanced technology in the form of spaceships and laser guns, aliens, robots. Then there's the buddy film. So the notion of the icons of two, most often men, but Thelma and Louise does a great job of making the buddy film about two women. And then, of course, the comic book film, which features people wearing tights. Then there's genres of intent, films that make you want to, your body, do something. So the comedy wants to make you laugh, right? And if you don't laugh, it's a failed comedy. The horror film, paradoxically, wants to make you look away because what you're seeing is too scary to see. So it makes you want to not see the film that you paid to see. The melodrama wants to make you cry. The pornographic film wants to make you feel erotic arousal. Then there's the matters of mise en scène, the composition of objects within the frame, how the movie looks. And so this would include film noir. And it would also include animation. So animation is not a genre unto itself. You can have an animated science fiction film, an animated horror film, but it is most often immediately recognizable as an animated film. So for example, with Up, you would see that the animated film begins with a melodramatic history of a person's life and then transfers into science fiction and fantasy. There's another type of genre is a sort of film defined by its relationship of narrative, how a story is told, and spectacle, what it looks like almost frozen in time.
Well, now they know, let it go, can't hold it back anymore, let it go.
These would include, obviously, the musical, so the story is told, and then the story kind of stops for a musical number to take place. Then the story continues, and then it kind of stops for a musical number to take place. Usually these become increasingly extravagant through the narrative until there's a climactic, concluding spectacle.
Are you satisfied if I play along? But the voice inside sings a different song. What is wrong with me? See the light as it shines on the sea. It's blinding, but no one knows how deep it goes.
The action film is similarly a sort of film defined by the relationship of narrative and spectacle. That there'll be, say for example, in the science fiction film The Matrix, opening, Trinity in trouble, and close quarters combat involving only 4 or 5 people. Then it escalates to Morpheus is fighting Neo, and there's much higher stakes, even though it's just 2 people fighting each other. Then it escalates further into the shootout at a sort of hotel tower type, with many more people involved and lots of guns. It escalates even further because we're going to need guns, lots of guns, culminating, of course, in the final Western-like showdown between Agent Smith and Neo. Now, typically when we think of syntax, we're thinking in terms of grammar and the structure of language. I shoot film. You read books. Those 2 very brief sentences, subject, predicate, object, direct object, they have identical grammatical structures, but the meaning is entirely different. The semantics are radically different. So syntax is about not the things themselves, but the relationship between the things. So the syntax of science fiction film, as Johnston offers, and I'll expand upon, focus first, most recognize, on the self, other, us, them. The voyage to the moon, the scientists go to the moon, they fight the aliens are not us, they're them. Then there's Metropolis, which has a very interesting sense of us, them, insofar as they're both us, but there's the ones above ground and the ones below ground. There's the elite living in the sun and the working class. They're both human, and the progress of the film is so they can reconcile the hand and the heart as it concludes. So that self-other is more psychological and rooted in a sense in which one group of the same species sees another group of the same species as fundamentally different, which obviously has nothing to do with politics or nationalism today. Then there's Cargo, which is very interesting as well, wherein the man recognizes his wife is now a zombie, she's an other, she's a not us, and he has to combat her to save their child. And he's infected and thus will become one of them. But to save his daughter, he progresses to a safe place. During that time, of course, he becomes one of them, a zombie. And so as he encroaches upon their territory, they shoot him, because he's not us, he's them, he's other. But the crying of the child awakens the woman, necessarily a woman in this case, to the value of the child, and she recognizes what the man has done, and now, instead of the 3 walking away, they dig him a grave, because they've recognized he was other, but actually he's us. So we're going to see really complicated versions of the self-other relationship in films like 2001: A Space Odyssey. We can also see the self-other play out in Superman, right? He's other, and he comes here, and we have to engage him and understand how he fits in our space or destroy him, and we're not going to do that. Well, we can't. Then there's Terminator, the self and other of the machines, who look at first human, clothed in their tissue and skin, but then burned away are clearly other. They're these metal skeletons. Alien and Aliens, it's obvious. With the Avengers, of course, the concluding fight is the self and the other, the us and the them of the aliens, who are mindless and faceless and just are cannon fodder. A specific articulation of self and other is found in the work of Russian formalist Stefan Todorov. Good luck closed captioning on capturing that one. He formulated this notion of the fantastic, a sliding scale from the marvelous, that which is other and comes out from beyond and arrives, and we need to come to an understanding, some agreement with it. And so Superman would be a perfect example of that. On the other end of the fantastic scale, you have the uncanny, which is that which seems to be us, but really isn't. So in this instance, it comes from the Freudian term unheimlich, or unnatural. And so in Alien, in the chestburster scene, John Hurt's character comes out, and he's been attacked by an alien, but he seems to have recovered. He's fine. He's us. But then, and we realize he's not, right? He's not who we thought he was. He's other. Now, I find this sliding scale very useful, especially for comic books, because on one hand, you've got The Marvelous and Captain Marvel coming out next year. In the original, Captain Marvel is a male figure from the Kree. He's an alien. He's a blatant Marvel ripoff of DC's Superman. And he arrives and fights for good on Earth. We understand him. We take him into our social sphere. And at the middle end of the Fantastic, we've got the Fantastic Four, who are four regular human beings who go into space and are bombarded with cosmic rays and then become transformed. They become fantastic. They become the Fantastic Four with their special powers. And then at the furthest end of the spectrum, beyond the marvelous, you've got the uncanny. So that which seems to be normal, seems to be us, but suddenly we recognize is not. And so we have the uncanny X-Men, right? And these are all the titles: the Captain Marvel, Fantastic Four, the uncanny X-Men. Mutant powers typically emerge in adolescence, and so they seem normal until they're not. Now, I don't know if Russian formalists read a lot of comic books or if Stan Lee read a lot of Russian formalism, but sometimes practitioners of an art come to concepts inductively through trial and error. And then theorists arrive at the same place, but through deductive reasoning and through analysis of specific filmic or comic book objects. Now, beyond the self and other or the scale of the fantastic, we've got the tension, the syntax of the present and the future. Of course, there's lots of science fiction films about time travel, the tension between the past and the future. Back to the Future clearly is about the relationship of and tension within the past and the future. But there's also many, many science fiction films which imagine a future, right? And yet that future is only imagined from the present. Gattaca, I think 1997, can only imagine a transformed, not so much through technology, but through social organization, can only imagine that transformed world and set of human relationships through what they know about the present. So a subset of these films engaged with the tension between the present and the future would be what Scott Buckman calls crisis cinema, wherein contemporary films take current problems and project them into a future consumed by them. So take in Blade Runner, and I don't want to offer any spoilers because we're not going to watch it till later in the week, but the world is grim, and it's always night, and it's always raining, and people want to go to the off-world colonies, but not many people can afford it. Sounds a lot like gated communities. Sounds a lot like urban flight. So with this, we can see in films like the Metropolis, right, which takes the current caste system of Germany, or in many, many nations where there's the haves and the have-nots, and projects it into a future where it's tremendously amplified and threatens the very nature of this civilization itself. Or, let's see, Star Wars situates itself in the paradox of a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, again, once upon a time, which is why many critics tag it as fantasy as much as anything else. Or The Matrix, which very much takes contemporary concerns about artificial intelligence. Not even contemporary. In '99, obviously, the filmmakers, the sisters Wachowski, were concerned about this and imagined this future wherein people and machines went to war and people lost. So we can see it in Serenity, taking concerns about totalitarianism, taking concerns about authoritarianism, and also not concerns so much, but recognition and maybe even the necessity of multiculturalism. Interstellar clearly is about the relationship of not just the present and the future, but the recognition that every future thus makes the present the past, and thus our present recognizes itself in the past. A subversion of cyberpunk is steampunk, which is precisely about that, often set in a timeline anterior before our own, but what if technology had developed in different ways? Now, here we want to distinguish between two types of science fiction, the speculative and the extrapolatory. The extrapolatory takes current circumstances and then projects them into the future, imagining how they might develop. So they extrapolate from what we know, and they'll stay within the boundaries of what we know. In contrast, we can look at speculative science fiction, which says, what if, right? So faster than light travel, which our current understanding of physics dictates as unavailable. But Star Wars says, hey, what if? Light speed. And while the extrapolative films, rather than asking what if, are more likely to say when this happens, right? One last matter I want to touch on, the self-other relationship, especially situated in The Thing, but certainly in films much after that, makes science fiction closely bound with horror. We can see this in films such as Alien, Event Horizon, and Scarlett Johansson's, I think, 2013 film Under the Skin. And in these circumstances, the self and the other, that relationship is obviously incredibly tense, and in the case of Alien and Species and Under the Skin, interpenetrative. Yet that interpenetration is not the acceptance of Captain Marvel or Superman. It's the destruction of the self at to the gain of the other. Another genre of film closely related to science fiction in many ways is fantasy. Now, on one hand, science fiction and fantasy are the same in that they imagine new worlds. They're about world building. If Hobbiton in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings doesn't come across as believable, then the story fails. If the whole territories, the 5 lands of the Lord of the Rings, can't be just visible to us and feel real, those whole sets were built in Peter Jackson's films so that we could be immersed in this fantasy world and it would be real for us. And similarly, in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, the LA of 2019 needs to feel lived in and used, and it seems to be possible. Nevertheless, they're very, very different in that science fiction typically looks forward in a way that fantasy looks backward. I mean, there's no guns in The Hobbit. I mean, it seems like that would solve a lot of problems. Sauron, you're going down. Right? So while both imagine worlds, one's mostly looking forward, one's mostly looking past, clearly there's some challenges there. Terry Brooks tries to situate his fantasy world of Shannara as some lived-in past, wherein there are some remnants that still are preserved, remnants of technology that are preserved in this fantasy world. But really, that's a kind of a grafting, an effort to seem different from most fantasy. So useful to keep in mind. So these are concepts that can seem really simple to some of you, could seem really complex. They might become part of your next mailbag, and I hope they enhance your understanding of our films this week. So I hope this worked for you. I hope you don't find it tremendously boring. Also, you should listen to The Heist and the Accomplice, but I don't think they exist anymore, so listen to Toro y Moi. Bye.